Iran on the brink. From all-out war rhetoric to internal revolt, Iran is once again at the center of global attention, but this time, the danger does not come only from foreign enemies or regional rivals. It is coming from within. The phrase all-out war, recently echoed by Iranian officials and amplified by state-linked voices, signals not only a warning to the outside world, but also a deep sense of fear inside the Islamic Republic itself. What makes this moment especially historic is that Iranian state television, long considered one of the supreme leader's strongest propaganda tools, has shown visible cracks, broadcasting content that appears to challenge or undermine the authority of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. For a system built on absolute control of information, this shift is nothing short of explosive. For decades, Iran's leadership has relied on a carefully balanced strategy: external confrontation to rally nationalist sentiment, and internal suppression to silence dissent. Whenever the regime faced economic collapse, mass protests, or legitimacy crises, it leaned heavily on the narrative of foreign plots and existential threats. By framing itself as the defender of Iran against the United States, Israel, and the West, the leadership justified repression at home. However, the current crisis suggests that this strategy may no longer be working. The language of all-out war now sounds less like confidence and more like desperation. At the heart of Iran's political system lies the supreme leader, whose authority extends over the military, judiciary, media, and key economic institutions. State television, in particular, has always functioned as a sacred space of loyalty. It presents the supreme leader as untouchable, infallible, and divinely guided. Any deviation from this narrative has historically been unthinkable, yet recent events, whether through hacking incidents, leaked footage, or unusually critical broadcasts, have shattered the illusion that state media is fully under control. Even the appearance of dissent on Iranian TV sends a powerful message to millions of viewers. The system is vulnerable. This vulnerability comes at a time when Iranian society is already under extreme pressure. Years of sanctions, corruption, and mismanagement have pushed the economy to the edge. Inflation has eaten away at salaries, unemployment has crushed the younger generation's hopes, and the national currency has lost much of its value. Ordinary Iranians are no longer debating abstract political theories. They are struggling to survive. When people cannot afford food, fuel, or rent, slogans about resistance and foreign enemies lose their power. In such an environment, even a small crack in state media can ignite massive public anger. The regime's response to this internal pressure has been twofold. On one hand, officials have escalated their rhetoric, warning that any threat to the supreme leader would be treated as an act of war. This messaging is aimed not just at foreign governments, but also at domestic opponents. It is a reminder that challenging the core of the system could bring catastrophic consequences. On the other hand, the leadership has intensified arrests, internet restrictions, and surveillance, trying to regain the information monopoly that once guaranteed its stability. Yet the more force it uses, the more it exposes its fear. What makes the current moment especially dangerous is the convergence of internal unrest and external tension. Iran is involved, directly or indirectly, in conflicts across the Middle East, from proxy wars to strategic standoffs. Any miscalculation could escalate into open confrontation with powerful enemies. In the past, such external crises helped the regime silence dissent at home by invoking national unity. But today, many Iranians no longer see foreign confrontation as a unifying cause. Instead, they see it as another burden imposed by leaders who refuse to address domestic suffering. The apparent shift within Iranian television reflects this changing reality. Whether caused by cyber operations, internal sabotage, or quiet rebellion within media institutions, the result is the same. The aura of absolute control is fading. For a system built on fear and obedience, perception matters as much as reality. When people see that even state media can be disrupted or questioned, they begin to imagine alternatives. They start to believe that the supreme leader's grip may not be as strong as it appears. This is why the all-out war language is so revealing. It suggests that the leadership views threats to its authority, symbolic or real, as existential. The supreme leader is not just a political figure. He is the cornerstone of the entire system. If his legitimacy collapses, the structure above and below him collapses as well. Iranian officials know this, which is why any challenge to him is framed as an attack on the nation itself. By equating criticism with treason, the regime hopes to maintain fear. But fear alone may no longer be enough. As Iran stands at this critical crossroads, the world is watching closely. The internal battle over information, legitimacy, and authority may prove more decisive than any missile strike or military clash. State television turning, even slightly, against the supreme leader is not just a media story. It is a signal of systemic decay. Combined with war rhetoric and public anger, it creates a volatile mix that could reshape Iran's future in ways few could have imagined. Information warfare and the collapse of control inside Iran. If Part 1 exposed the visible cracks in Iran's power structure, Part 2 dives deeper into the battlefield where this crisis is increasingly being decided: information. In modern Iran, control over narratives has always been as important as control over weapons. The Islamic Republic was built not only through revolution, but through messaging, carefully crafted sermons, televised speeches, and state-approved news that shaped how citizens understood reality. Today, that information machine is under direct attack, and the regime is struggling to defend it. For decades, Iranian state television functioned as the regime's loudest and most disciplined voice. It did not merely report events, it defined them. Protests were labeled as foreign-backed riots, economic failures were blamed on sanctions alone, and loyalty to the supreme leader was presented as a religious and national duty. This system worked because alternatives were limited. Independent media was crushed, journalists were jailed, and the internet was heavily filtered. But technology has changed the rules of the game, and Iran is now paying the price for trying to fight a digital war with outdated tools. The recent incidents involving Iranian television, whether direct hacks, internal leaks, or unexpected content, represent more than technical failures. They symbolize a loss of narrative sovereignty. When viewers see messages that contradict official propaganda, even briefly, it creates cognitive shock. People begin asking questions they were trained not to ask. Is the supreme leader truly untouchable? Is the state as unified as it claims? Are there others inside the system who no longer believe? In authoritarian systems, these questions are dangerous because they spread faster than the regime can contain them. The Iranian leadership understands this threat very well. That is why its reaction has been swift and severe. Internet slowdowns, nationwide blackouts during protests, arrests of journalists, and new laws targeting psychological warfare are all signs of a state under siege. Yet these measures reveal a contradiction at the heart of the regime. By cracking down harder, it confirms the very instability it tries to deny. Every shutdown tells citizens that the government is afraid of what they might see or say. Every arrest turns journalists into symbols of resistance. At the same time, Iranian society has evolved. A large portion of the population is young, digitally literate, and deeply connected to global culture. This generation did not experience the 1979 revolution firsthand, nor do they feel emotionally bound to its ideology. For them, legitimacy comes from performance, jobs, stability, dignity, not from slogans or religious authority. When state television fails to reflect their lived reality, it loses credibility. And once credibility is lost, propaganda becomes noise. This generational divide is one of the most underestimated threats facing the Islamic Republic. Older elites still believe that fear and control are sufficient. Younger Iranians, however, have learned to navigate censorship, bypass filters, and consume alternative narratives. Even when the internet is restricted, information finds ways to move through messaging apps, satellite channels, and offline networks. The regime may slow the flow, but it cannot stop it entirely. In this environment, even a single moment of dissent on state TV can echo for weeks online. The language of all-out war must be understood within this context. While it is aimed outward, it also serves as a warning inward. The leadership is signaling that challenges to the supreme leader, especially symbolic ones, will be treated as existential threats. This framing allows the regime to justify extreme measures under the banner of national security. However, it also raises the stakes dramatically. When everything becomes a matter of survival, compromise disappears and escalation becomes more likely. Ironically, this rigidity may accelerate the system's decline. History shows that regimes which rely exclusively on force and fear eventually lose their ability to adapt. Iran's leadership appears trapped by its own narrative. It cannot admit failure without undermining its legitimacy. Yet, it cannot solve the underlying economic and social crises without fundamental change. State media, once a shield, now reflects this paralysis. The more it tries to project strength, the more hollow that projection appears to a population living in daily hardship. Another critical factor is the growing split within Iran's own institutions. While the regime presents a united front, signs of internal disagreement are increasingly visible. Bureaucrats, media workers, technocrats, and even some religious figures are quietly distancing themselves from hardline positions. They may not openly rebel, but hesitation, silence, and passive resistance are powerful signals in a tightly controlled system. When loyalty becomes performative rather than genuine, control weakens from the inside. Information warfare also has an international dimension. Foreign governments, exile groups, and activist networks closely monitor Iranian media and amplify any sign of dissent. A brief disruption on state TV can become global news within minutes, magnifying its impact far beyond Iran's borders. This external amplification frustrates Tehran, which sees it as proof of foreign interference. Yet blaming outsiders does not address the root problem, the system's inability to maintain internal consent. As Iran moves forward, the struggle over information will only intensify. The regime can tighten controls, but doing so risks further alienating the population. It can attempt reforms, but that risks opening doors it may not be able to close. State television, once a symbol of unchallenged authority, now stands at the center of this dilemma. Every broadcast is a test of credibility. Every silence is interpreted as weakness. In the end, the question is no longer whether Iran faces a crisis, but how deep that crisis runs. The battle is not just over territory or power, but over truth itself. When citizens no longer trust what they see on their own screens, the foundations of authority begin to crumble. The all-out war rhetoric may intimidate enemies, but it cannot rebuild trust at home. And without trust, even the strongest systems eventually fracture. The supreme leader's legitimacy crisis and the risk of systemic collapse. As Iran moves deeper into this moment of uncertainty, the focus increasingly narrows to one central question: legitimacy. Power alone has never been enough to sustain the Islamic Republic. From its earliest days, the system relied on a carefully constructed belief that the supreme leader was not merely a political ruler, but a moral and religious authority chosen to guide the nation. Today, that belief is under unprecedented strain. The unrest, the information leaks, and even the subtle shifts in state media all point toward a crisis that strikes at the very heart of Iran's political identity. The supreme leader's authority was designed to be absolute, yet invisible in its coercion. Ideally, citizens would obey not because they were afraid, but because they believed obedience was righteous and necessary. Over time, however, the gap between ideology and lived reality widened. Economic hardship, corruption scandals, and violent crackdowns eroded public trust. What once appeared as divine guardianship now looks, to many Iranians, like unaccountable rule. When legitimacy fades, even the most powerful institutions begin to wobble. This legitimacy crisis is not confined to the streets. It extends into the bureaucratic and institutional core of the state. Judges, civil servants, media professionals, and even members of the clergy operate within a system that demands loyalty while offering diminishing returns. As sanctions tighten and resources shrink, internal competition intensifies. Positions that once guaranteed security and prestige now come with public anger and moral burden. Quiet disillusionment spreads, creating an atmosphere where compliance is mechanical rather than sincere. State television's symbolic shift, whether intentional or forced, reflects this deeper erosion. Media workers are often among the first to sense when a system is losing its narrative grip. They see the contradictions daily: official optimism versus empty wallets, triumphant speeches versus funerals of protesters. When the message no longer matches reality, even loyal professionals face an internal conflict. Over time, this tension produces mistakes, leaks, and moments of hesitation that authoritarian systems find difficult to forgive or fully prevent. The supreme leader's response to these challenges has largely followed a familiar pattern: firmness, warnings, and appeals to external threats. By framing dissent as foreign sabotage, the leadership attempts to preserve a moral boundary between true Iranians and enemies. Yet this strategy is showing signs of exhaustion. When nearly every criticism is labeled treason, the term loses meaning. Ordinary citizens, suffering from inflation and insecurity, struggle to see how their daily frustrations are part of an international conspiracy. Instead, they increasingly associate hardship with domestic decision-making. This shift in perception is dangerous for a system built on centralized authority. Once citizens stop viewing the supreme leader as a protector, they begin to see him as a participant in their suffering. At that point, fear replaces respect, and fear is a weaker foundation for long-term stability. It requires constant enforcement, constant surveillance, and constant escalation. Each step taken to maintain control also increases resentment, creating a cycle that becomes harder to break with every protest and crackdown. The risk of systemic collapse does not necessarily mean sudden revolution. More often, such systems decay gradually through loss of efficiency, coordination, and belief. Orders are followed slowly. Rules are enforced selectively. Loyalty becomes conditional. In Iran's case, this slow erosion is already visible. Infrastructure failures, economic mismanagement, and bureaucratic paralysis are not just technical problems. They are political symptoms. They reveal a state struggling to mobilize its own institutions effectively. Another critical dimension of the legitimacy crisis is the role of religion. The Islamic Republic fused political authority with religious leadership, making criticism of the supreme leader appear sacrilegious. However, this fusion also means that political failures damage religious credibility. When citizens associate religious authority with corruption or violence, faith itself becomes politicized and contested. Some Iranians respond by rejecting religion's role in governance altogether, while others seek alternative interpretations that challenge official doctrine. Either path weakens the regime's ideological monopoly. Externally, Iran's leadership faces a strategic dilemma. Escalation abroad can distract from internal unrest, but it also increases pressure on an already fragile economy. Military posturing and all-out war rhetoric may rally hardline supporters, yet they deepen isolation and sanctions, worsening domestic conditions. Each foreign confrontation thus carries internal costs. The leadership must balance deterrence with survival, strength with sustainability. So far, it has struggled to strike that balance. What makes the current moment especially volatile is the convergence of long-term structural weaknesses with immediate political shocks. The system is not only facing protests, it is facing disbelief. When citizens no longer accept official explanations, the state loses its ability to define reality. This loss is far more dangerous than any single demonstration. It means that even silence can be interpreted as resistance, and even obedience can hide defiance. Within this environment, the supreme leader's image becomes a focal point. Efforts to protect his authority through censorship, intimidation, and symbolic gestures may slow the erosion, but they cannot reverse it entirely. Authority that must constantly defend itself is already compromised. The more the system insists on unquestioned loyalty, the more it reveals its fear of losing control. Iran now stands at a critical threshold. The legitimacy crisis surrounding the supreme leader is not an isolated problem. It is the central axis around which all other crises revolve. Economic pain, information warfare, social unrest, and international tension all feed into this single question. Who has the right to rule and why? Until that question is answered in a way that resonates with the population, instability will remain a permanent feature of Iranian politics. What comes next for Iran? Revolution, repression, or dangerous stalemate? As Iran enters this decisive phase, the future remains uncertain, but the range of possible outcomes is becoming clearer. The country is no longer operating under normal political conditions. What it faces now is a defining test of survival for the Islamic Republic itself. The combination of internal unrest, a legitimacy crisis surrounding the supreme leader, economic exhaustion, and escalating call of an all-out war rhetoric has pushed the system toward a point where maintaining the status quo is increasingly difficult. The question is not whether Iran will change, but how that change will unfold, and at what cost. One possible path is intensified repression. Historically, the Iranian leadership has responded to existential threats by tightening its grip. This includes mass arrests, expanded surveillance, harsher punishments, and even greater control over the internet and media. In the short term, such measures can restore a sense of order. Fear can silence streets, disrupt organizing, and force compliance. However, repression does not solve the underlying problems. It merely freezes them in place, allowing anger and resentment to grow beneath the surface. Over time, this pressure builds, making future explosions more violent and less predictable. Another scenario is prolonged stalemate. In this outcome, neither the state nor its opponents achieve decisive victory. Protests flare up periodically, then subside. The economy limps along without real recovery. State television continues to project confidence, while citizens quietly reject its message. This kind of stagnation can last for years, slowly draining the system of energy and credibility. While it may appear stable from the outside, such a stalemate is dangerous because it erodes institutions from within. Efficiency declines, corruption spreads, and trust disappears. Eventually, even small shocks, a fuel shortage, a disputed decision, or a symbolic media incident, can trigger major unrest. The most dramatic possibility is fundamental political transformation. This does not necessarily mean a sudden revolution or regime collapse. It could take the form of elite fragmentation, internal reform attempts, or a gradual shift in power away from the supreme leader's office. In such a scenario, elements within the system may conclude that survival requires change. However, reform is risky in a system built on centralized authority. Any concession can be interpreted as weakness, encouraging further demands. This fear has long paralyzed Iranian leadership, making bold reform unlikely unless the alternative appears even more threatening. External pressure adds another layer of complexity. Iran's confrontational posture toward its enemies, framed through all-out war language, raises the risk of miscalculation. While the leadership may believe that aggression deters foreign intervention, it also increases isolation and economic strain. Sanctions deepen hardship for ordinary citizens, reinforcing domestic anger. In this way, external conflict and internal instability feed off each other. What is presented as strength abroad often translates into suffering at home. State media will continue to play a crucial role in shaping this trajectory. Iranian television is no longer just a propaganda tool, it is a battlefield. Every broadcast, every interruption, and every silence carries political weight. The regime understands this, which is why it reacts so aggressively to any perceived loss of control. Yet the very need for such control highlights the system's fragility. When authority depends entirely on managing perception, reality becomes the greatest threat. For ordinary Iranians, the future is filled with uncertainty. Many no longer expect quick solutions or dramatic victories. Instead, they navigate daily life with caution, resilience, and quiet defiance. Their expectations of the state have shifted downward, while their expectations of themselves and their communities have grown stronger. This social transformation is subtle but powerful. It changes how people relate to authority, how they interpret official messages, and how they imagine alternatives. Internationally, Iran is increasingly viewed as a state under internal siege. Allies watch nervously, enemies look for opportunities, and neutral observers prepare for instability. Any major internal shift could reshape the balance of power in the Middle East. This is why the current crisis matters far beyond Iran's borders. It is not just about one country's leadership, but about the regional and global consequences of a system struggling to maintain control. Ultimately, the central issue remains legitimacy. Power enforced by fear can last for a time, but it is brittle. Once citizens stop believing in the moral or political right of their rulers to govern, authority becomes transactional and temporary. Iran appears to be crossing that threshold. The supreme leader's image, once carefully protected, is now openly contested in ways that were unimaginable in the past. State television turning, even symbolically, against him is not the cause of this crisis, but a symptom of it. What comes next will depend on choices made under pressure. The regime can double down on repression, risking long-term collapse. It can drift in stalemate, slowly hollowing itself out. Or it can attempt controlled change, risking loss of control in order to regain legitimacy. None of these paths are safe. All carry consequences that will shape Iran for generations. One thing, however, is already clear. Iran has entered a new era, one in which information cannot be fully controlled, loyalty cannot be assumed, and authority must constantly justify itself. The language of all-out war may project strength, but it cannot restore belief. And without belief, no system, no matter how powerful, can remain stable forever. If you found this breakdown insightful and want more deep analysis on global power, hidden conflicts, and political turning points, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep this content coming, so don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for the next deep dive.